Good morning, folks. Just wanted to say a few words about the last couple of logical fallacies that we see in Chapter 5 of our textbook. We didn't get a chance to cover issues related to causality, or what the author of the text calls the false cause or questionable cause fallacy. And we also need to take a look at questionable analogies. I think it's pretty clear that when we're talking about causality, that we are alleging that one event is not just sufficient, but necessary for bringing about another state of affairs. Now, just to give an easy example here, suppose that somebody all of a sudden gets sick. Now, we might want to search for what the source of that sickness is. And we might argue something like this. Mr. Smith just got violently ill. Methinks it might be because he just ate a hamburger during lunchtime. Now, the author's clear about this, that this might commit a fallacy that's sometimes referred to this way. Post hoc, ergo propter hoc. This is a Latin phrase that roughly means after this, therefore because of this. What this fallacy too quickly does is infer that simply because two events are temporally linked, or appear to be temporally linked, that the former must be the cause of the latter. Now, the way to determine whether or not a causal argument is reasonable or not is to look into the specific details of the situation. Are the two things being connected likely relevant to one another? Well, in the case I just gave, most of us would induce that people don't just get sick for no reason. We infer that there must have been some kind of cause, and a likely cause might be something that the person had recently eaten. So it's not a far stretch to consider the food that the individual ate that day as a possible cause. However, we shouldn't leap to any causal conclusions unless we are absolutely sure that other possible factors have not been ruled out. Next, a few words on analogies. Recall that causes, when we're arguing that something is the cause of something else, we are arguing that some particular event or thing is a necessary condition for bringing about a state of affairs. When we're looking at analogies, folks, remember that an analogy is a comparison. An argumentative analogy is an effective one if we are comparing two relevantly similar but different things to one another. Now, the idea is we hope that our audience understands one part of the analogy well, and then we try to convince them that they ought to hold a similar position about something else. Now, let me go from one of these easy sort of examples. Very frequently in politics, if a particular leader is trying to persuade us that we need to take military action, they might decide to call upon some past military action and say, well, this one is kind of like this one. And if you thought it was reasonable to take military action in this case, then it ought to follow that it will be reasonable to take military action in this other case. I'll go for the easy example. During the second Iraq invasion, those people who tended to be for it tended to draw a comparison between invading Iraq and World War II. They painted Saddam Hussein as another Hitler, and thus the need to save the world. Now notice, if you tended to be against the war, you were more likely to compare it to Vietnam. Now, I'm not about to argue that either of these analogies is a good one. As a matter of fact, I would argue they are both probably problematic in some way. What I am suggesting is that the analogies that we are psychologically likely to accept are the ones that are likely to make our case for us, whether or not the analogies are in fact apt analogies or not. Now, to determine whether or not an analogy is a reasonable one or not, you ought to dig deep into the two things being compared and to look as to whether or not the two things are actually relevantly similar. If you can find good reasons for believing that the things being compared are not all that similar, then it's a disanalogy and you ought to call it out as a questionable analogy. Now, one last side note on this. There is no such thing as a perfect analogy. So all we're really looking for here is whether or not an analogy is a reasonable one or not. If it is reasonable, we ought to provisionally accept it. If the two things being compared are not relatively similar, reject it. Now, two last things from the chapter that I'm not going to be giving a whole lot of focus on. I want to mention what the author of our text calls quibbling. Now, what the author's getting at here is our tendency to find one little flaw with a particular argument, which might otherwise be a generally good argument, and to call it out simply because of a minor but insignificant error. Now, the Foundation for Critical Thinking, in their Guide to Critical Thinking, actually uses the metaphor of failing to see the forest for the trees when they're talking about this idea. This occurs whenever an individual who's trying to reject an argument or convince us that we ought to reject an argument, they will find one tiny little flaw in the argument, not even necessarily a significant flaw, but they'll upplay that flaw, hoping that they can get the audience to reject the argument. Now, they call it failure to see the forest for the trees because we take this tiny little problem and then we amplify it in hopes that we can get the entire argument to be rejected, when in fact it's an otherwise good argument. Now, the last thing that the author talks about is called false charge of fallacy. I will not be emphasizing this in a testing environment, but the point the author's trying to make here is in part that whenever we go out on these fallacy hunts, and we're working very hard to find fallacies, and this might also apply to quibbling, we might actually be more apt to call out an argument for being fallacious, when it may not really be that problematic, or it might actually be a fairly decent argument with minor flaws. Resist the urge to do that, and instead apply what philosophers sometimes call the principle of charity. This is, rather than just going out trying to find reasons to reject arguments, we should actually be seeking the truth. So what we should be doing is looking at arguments for their strengths and weaknesses. And perhaps if someone's not a good arguer, perhaps there's things that that person might be missing, that if we added it to that argument, that it might bolster it, and it might actually be a fairly reasonable position if we only gave it a chance. Now, the other sort of side issue about false charge of fallacy, I have seen situations on, what do we call it, when people are making comments on arguments and news articles in online settings, I have seen people, actually using names of fallacies to try to say, well, you better reject this argument because it commits this fallacy. Well, before you determine whether or not you should reject the argument because it commits some fallacy or other, you should probably actually look at the argument and see if the fallacy it's being charged with, it has indeed been committed. I have seen people try to call arguments out for fallacies when they didn't commit them at all. I think for sort of ad hominem reasons. In other words, if you can call out a particular arguer for committing fallacies, you might lead the audience just to reject everything that they have to say out of hand. And I would suggest you try to reject the urge to do this. Thanks.